Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of the Historians Lounge here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia. Many of you know me as the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill. And in this episode of the Historians Lounge, we're actually going to travel to a more familiar place. We're actually going to stay in country in the U.S. for this particular topic, viewers and listeners. Now, you've heard me talk about a lot of things when it comes to the Americas. I've talked a lot about medical history with a lot of historians, military history, folk history, and so forth. But we haven't had a lot of food history here on the channel, particularly in the US. And joining me today is a guest I am super excited to have on the show because we're going to be talking about one of America's most iconic foods, and that is the Philadelphia cheesesteak. Now, many of you may be a little puzzled by that, but what if I told you that this one food item has ties to gender, blue collar history, film and media representations, particularly the Rocky films, and many more? So buckle up and get ready because you are going to be full with knowledge. And joining us today is a really good friend of mine who I am so excited to announce as Dr. Chrissie Reilly. Chrissie, welcome back to the show.
Awesome, Gabe. You are the best. Thank you so much for having me on the show again and letting me talk about food history. I am literally the food historian at gmail.com. So it's amazing that I get to talk about this and that I get to talk about Philly cheesesteaks, which I also got the opportunity under Dr. Warren Belasco to literally study in a fall and spring semester, like back to back, during my doctoral studies. So uh, it, I'm thrilled to be here. This is great. Living the dream.
Awesome, Chrissy. I'm so excited to have you here back on the show. And if you may notice, viewers and listeners, as I said, Dr. Chrissie Reilly, because for those who remember, the last time my friend Chrissy was back on the show, she was in the process of getting her doctorate. So, Chris, before we dive into this topic, which you are very, very passionate about, would you like to share with the viewers and listeners a little life update, what you've been up to since the last time you were on the show back in 2025?
So I'm excited about everything, Gabe. There, anything worth doing is worth overdoing. So I feel like if you're going to be enthusiastic, be over enthusiastic. But I finished my doctorate from University of Maryland, Baltimore County, repping my UMBC shirt. Go Retrievers.
Nice.
I finished in May of 2025. My dissertation was not on culinary history. I was on new military history as sort of the notion of looking at the way culture and Durkheim's concepts of the sacred and the profane overlap with the notion of work and the mundane and the everyday. And I did oral history interviews with folks based on a deployment to Ramstein Air Base in 2022 in covering the what's called the RFF deployment, a request for forces deployment there. So very different from culinary history, but something that I turned out to be equally passionate about. So yeah, and then now I get to be Dr. Chrissie Reilly. So I love it. It's good
Awesome,
to be on this
Chrissy.
side.
That's amazing. And you know what? That's a lot of hard work, and congratulations to you because that is quite an achievement. And I can think of no better person to deserve the title of doctor. I mean, talking with you is just so fascinating. And just, I learn new things every day when I talk with everybody in my inner circle, my close friends. And I'm so excited to dive back into the realm of food history, particularly this piece of American food history, the Philadelphia cheesesteak. So walk us through it, Chrissy. What really drew you to examine the cheesecake out of all of the iconic food staples in the US as the main focus of, a jumping point to dive into gender history, blue collar history, film and media, and stuff like that?
So, one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that studying the Philadelphia cheesesteak made me realize my own bias. I come from, you know, Bruce Springsteen country. I grew up off of Exit 98, uh, Point Pleasant Beach, New Jersey. And to me, cheesesteaks were something that were ubiquitous. Like it was something that was always around. And you might have to go to Philly for the best one, but you could find one on the Jersey Shore. You could find one on the boardwalk. You could find one in South Jersey. Like I went to college at Rowan. So it wasn't it it wasn't something that was exotic necessarily. It was only later, after having lived in Maryland, after having traveled quite a bit, after I'd lived in the southeast in the US for a bit, and I realized that it wasn't something that was commonplace. People didn't necessarily know what I was talking about. It wasn't a frame of reference for everyone. And I had the opportunity to like sort of have that lens like flipped back on myself, like in an Edic emic sort of way, making the strange familiar, the familiar strange. Anyone who's a student of anthropology might understand this, but it made me really examine this, and how I saw things was that this was really regional, that it was something that was of a place, for a place, by a place. I mean, if you think of um, you know, there's the concept of like New York pizza. And
Yes.
okay, it has a but there's also like Chicago style pizza. And they're not the same. But you don't have there's not a there's not any other type of cheesesteak. It's always a Philadelphia cheesesteak, right?
Yes.
And so it made me realize that okay, maybe there's more to this. And I was fortunate enough that one of my professors at the time, Dr. Warren Belasco, who is a food historian, gave me the freedom to study the cheesesteak as both a fall and spring semester long project to look at it was to really look at what this was, what it meant, where it was situated within the culinary history of a place, what else was around it, and then I got even more fortunate that I had close friends and fellow historians that were willing to join me and research it too. Um, Brian Howat, he's a historian. He works in Philadelphia. He's from South Jersey. Uh, Professor Melissa Ziobro, she's been on the show before. She's a New Jersey native. She really dove into looking at like the gendered notions of the cheesesteak. Dr. Sarah Cole, we were in the same cohort together at our graduate program. She graduated about 10 years before I did, and then wound up on my dissertation committee as Dr. Cole. But she looked at the media representations of the cheesesteak, and I latched onto the concept of what about the cheesesteak outside of Philadelphia? What is it? What is it beyond the Schuylkill? And the Schuylkill is a famous river that goes through Philadelphia. Uh,
Hmm.
and the idea that there's no odes to cheesesteak, the way Proust, talked about the Madeleine. But like it's not just a sandwich. But it's also not a cheeseburger. And so I was really looking at like, is there a way to examine the etymology of the cheesesteak? Could it be traced back to an axiomatic starting point? Is there a cheesesteak zero? And I think that the answer is yeah, it totally can. And when we think about all of the things that we eat today, do we know who ate the first one?
Not really.
right? Once I found this, I was like, oh, I was excited like you would not believe, like excited even for me. Um, and so it was, it at first it was only known as a steak sandwich. It debuted in 1930 from a South Philly hot dog vendor. His name was Pat Olivieri. Um, he was he was selling and eating hot dogs every day because that's what his business was. He had a hot dog cart. So he decided to like fry up like sliced steak with some onions and he put it in a hot dog bun. And then that the cheesesteak, that was the steak sandwich. It wasn't until about 10 years later that it became a cheesesteak. So even how we think of the sandwich, that if you look at street signs in Philadelphia and if there's signs that say steak sandwiches, they typically are older than the businesses that say cheesesteaks
Mm,
by about 10 years, maybe. Um, because in the 1930s, it would have been much more difficult to have had enough cheese to be able to sell at a hot dog stand at a food cart in in the city. When you're thinking about like rationing and ration stamps and things like that, um,
right.
and it was during the Great Depression. So you've got the Great Depression going into World War II. You really wouldn't have had the ability to necessarily have cheese with these things due to scarcity. And especially if you're working in blue collar neighborhoods in South Philadelphia, your customers wouldn't have expected it anyway at that point. So it became the cheesesteak, but it didn't start out as one. So there's also like a little bit of an evolution of things to it.
Yeah, and also talking about this thing of evolution, it's almost like synonymous is that if a cheesesteak is not greasy in the paper bag, it's not a true cheesesteak. And I like to give a reference. It was actually, I forgot what episode it was, talking about film medium representation, where the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, the original, where Will said, like, I want to get a cheesesteak. And I remember in that episode, um, Uncle Phil and Carlton said, like, well, here's cheesesteak. Like, no, this ain't a cheesesteak. It's like, it's not in a paper bag. It's not greasy. And it's
Mm-hmm.
so interesting how when we think of that, we think of like that's synonymous. And if it doesn't come in the paper bag, it has to come with the dip. It has to come with the juice that you would dip the sandwich in. And it's so interesting how there are so many like iconic things about it. Because if you really break it down, Chrissy, which I'm pretty sure you did in your research, is probably, the original representation of original French cuisine, which was very, very limited ingredients, cheap cuts of meat, all mashed together to create something really, really, really delicious. And it is so, so incredibly interesting that a food item such as this has a lot of history to it. So I guess let's start at the beginning. So in your research, how did the role of gender play into the evolution and the further refinement of the Philly cheesesteak?
So that's something that actually came way later. That
Oh,
the
okay.
the notion of gender with the cheesesteak came along as the idea of someone wanting a chicken cheesesteak. And this is something that's happened in like the 90s, early 2000s, 2010s,
Ah,
that the cheesesteak used to always be beef. And then it was later that the idea of having a chicken cheesesteak might appeal to more females. And so how does
ah,
that, like as something that was healthier or seen as like a more valorized food for a female audience rather than the original like unhealthy um, beef steak would be. And it's a it, I don't know if it's any healthier necessarily, but there's a marketing aspect to it. And I
right.
think when people look at, they're having which is healthier, steak or chicken. I think most people might say chicken. It tends to be leaner, tends to be like less greasy, but yeah, there's definitely this concept of gendered eating along the cheesesteak lines. If you're looking at something like a chicken cheesesteak, and it, I actually, one of the things you mentioned, Gabe, that kind of, I mean, my little historian antlers go up was the idea of, you talked about dipping something. So the structure of a cheesesteak, it looks like a French dip, right?
Yes.
It's this fantastic soft bread. It's got beef inside. It's grilled, and you should be dipping it into like an au jus sauce. Except in a Philly cheesesteak, you don't. And the the neighborhood from which the Philly cheesesteak came from was actually an Italian American neighborhood and not a French. Like it didn't
Mm.
it doesn't have like a French culinary ancestry in that way, that it can't trace its lineage to that, even though the structure is the same. I think that might be coincidental because there's lots of things that can be on a, whether you call it a sub or a hoagie. I call it a sub. I'm from New Jersey, it happens. But so I think some places call it a grinder. But this notion of the shape of a food might look some way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's indicative of all of the foods that have that structure. And I
Yes.
think that's also what makes the cheesesteak fascinating. That this is not just a blue collar food from Philly, it also is one that came from really an Italian American enclave in South Philadelphia. So
Mm.
yeah, it has the structure of something that resembles something French, but isn't, which I also love.
That's actually very interesting. Now I feel like I'm going to get roasted in the comments for making that distinction, but it's food history. I can take it. But honestly, Chrissy, it is fascinating because I did not know about the history of, like, the cheesesteak, that it does have an Italian American background. But it also brings up this notion of, the idea of, like, the working class food. And if you really do think about it, the structure of a cheesesteak is the essentials. You have bread, that's the carbs. You have the meat, that is the protein. You have the onions and the cheese, those give it flavor. You want something that's going to be very versatile. You want something that's
Mhm.
going to be quick that you can put away. And this, I'm actually very curious, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. In your professional opinion, do you believe that the French dip, the cheesesteak, and many other hot sandwiches, using a modern term now, kickstarted or are the blueprint of the modern day hot sandwiches that we see in places like Subway, Firehouse Subs, Jersey Mike's, and so forth?
I'm going to give you an annoying historian sort of answer. Well, or I could say it depends, but I'll choose an answer from the improv community. Yes, and I feel like, so I actually come from Point Pleasant, New Jersey, where Jersey Mike's was started. And so the concept of, to me, a Jersey Mike sandwich, now has the Cancro family has since sold it, and it now is owned by like a big company. But when it started, these were largely like cold sandwiches, not hot ones. But I do think you're correct otherwise in saying the idea that like the cheesesteak absolutely helped to usher in a movement of other hot sandwiches as it became popular and went elsewhere, even if it remained both of a place and was able to be appreciated as something that was local, even if you could buy one in Los Angeles, for example.
Right.
Um, like it's something that like this is not a cuisine that was well established before appearing in the United States and was imported here. Like the cheesesteak like took shape and was created directly from the overlap of like consumer preference and the individuals who produced it. Like it, in a very small area in South Philadelphia. Um, but there's also, like, as you've said, like, what does it take for something to be like a hot sandwich? So there's like parameters that a sandwich, in order to even to be a hot sandwich, it has to be a sandwich first, must have in order for it to be considered a cheesesteak, eh, allowing that there's still a little bit of a gray area for what makes a cheesesteak authentic. Um, like, and I think that's why I love it, because it's both its own thing that is a definite thing, as well as a little bit of a paradox. That, like, it's an obscure local favorite and a blue collar food icon.
Yes.
So to me, like, that Venn diagram, and like where it is both circles, there's 100% overlap, there's no overlap. It's perfect.
It is. And it kind of brings up this notion of a thing of like, what is considered a true and through Philly cheesesteak? It's almost the same notion of what is considered a New York style pizza, because there are a lot of pizzerias that claim to be New York style. I'm going to use, my own personal example. Whenever me and my family go out to a restaurant and we see New York style, for us, the staple is Grimaldi's. For us, that is New York style. And there's a difference between New York style traditional and New York style for, at a bodega. Now, comment section for people in the East Coast, be merciful with the comments, but I am just making a point that when you think of a food item, you expect it to be a certain way, even if you've never tasted it. And it's almost like the original concept of fast food with McDonald's. If you buy a McDonald's hamburger in California, you expect it to be the same thing as you got in Boston. And that's kind of the same thing that, at least from what I've seen, just going to different places with foods and like sandwiches and like in this case a Philly cheesesteak, is that there are the basic fundamentals that a cheesesteak needs to have. It needs to have a certain type of bread, needs to have a certain cut of meat, needs to have a certain type of cheese and onions. But depending on the region, they may change up the onions for something a little sweeter, may change up the cheese for a little heat or spice. They may marinate the meat, certainly. So it is really, really interesting. And if you look at this as a regular item in history, in the case of, let's go with a military history for like body armor, there is a core component that, is the basis. It's like there are slight deviations, but they have a common purpose. So, Chrissy, I would like to hear your thoughts on, this idea of the cheesesteak. No matter what the region is, it's going to, in theory, be a cheesesteak as you would anywhere else. Or possibly, do you think cheesecakes now are slightly different in terms of, from your research, of what the original Philly cheesesteaks were like, given the resources that they had during the Great Depression?
So just by the notion of calling them a cheesesteak makes them different than the original. The original didn't have cheese, and we know this. There's been interviews done with the gentleman who created the first one, and cheese wasn't something that he had on his hot dog cart. Another thing that I find kind of fascinating is that the there's some places now that you can get it with Cheese Whiz as the cheese. That it's like a lot of places have provolone. I prefer the provolone. But if like the liquidy Cheese Whiz, like it comes in a tub, like it is, a science project of a food here. But that was like the sandwich debuted 80 years ago. The addition of like cheese was like 70 years ago. This is public math, so this might be wrong. But like Cheese Whiz was not invented at least for like another 20 years after the sandwich was first created. So it's not possible to have a cheesesteak now with Cheese Whiz as it was first served in the 1930s. Not possible because, you know, timelines and math being what they are, Cheese Whiz wasn't invented at the same time that the first cheesesteak was served.
Mm.
And yet, it doesn't make a cheesesteak with Cheese Whiz any less authentic. And I think that that's also part of the human condition. We get to define what is and is not authentic. And there's also this notion, like things like, is a chicken cheesesteak less authentic, even if it's prepared identically otherwise as the original cheesesteak, rather the original steak sandwich, but it uses chicken instead of beef? Is that less authentic than one that is made with beef but has Cheese Whiz? Or ones that have mayonnaise or lettuce or ketchup or marinara sauce. Or, I mean, these I think are seen as being on the edges of like cheesesteak authenticity. And I feel like at times I sound like an insufferable hipster talking about this, but this is I've spent a lot of years of my life studying cheesesteaks. But I think that it also looks into things like, how do things get accepted as mainstream? And who was it? He's a geographer, Wilbur Zielinski. He talks about how ethnic foods become accepted as mainstream in the enigma of ethnicity. And these same principles apply to food as non-ethnic as a cheesesteak. So what Zielinski argues is that the food has to be authentic yet Americanized. And so in order to accomplish this, the food has to be both recognizable and unique. So like cheesesteak aficionados, cheesesteak purists might balk and throw their hands up and get the vapors over like the idea of cheesesteak soup or cheesesteak egg rolls or cheesesteak pizza. These things are what Zielinski refers to as consciously modifying, end quote, that allows it allows the cheesesteak sandwich to be seen as authentic. You've got a foil, not quite like a Shakespearean foil, but if you know what I'm talking about, like stick with me here.
Yes.
And so whether the cheese is actual dairy or a Cheese Whiz sauce, and whether the steak is finely chopped or in strips, or if it is steak or chicken, it's by comparison with what is seen as an idealized original that allows the food to be seen as authentic or not. So, I mean, you mentioned when you're going for New York pizza, Grimaldi's. I've never heard of this chain. It might be amazing, or it might be a local place. I don't know. When I think of New York style pizza, I only think of mom and pop places that I grew up with, like on the Jersey Shore, but it doesn't mean that there's places that are further afield that don't also produce something that tastes the same. Like, do we want to taste the nostalgia of New York pizza, or does it have to actually be from New York? Does it have to be shipped from Manhattan or any of the 5 boroughs to be authentic? Or is it the style that matters regardless of where you serve it?
Yeah, that is very true.
I think a little bit of it, the notion of like beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Authenticity might be in the eye of the consumer. If we're eating it and it feels a certain way and it makes us feel a certain way and it evokes a certain feel, is that not right? I'm sure I'm going to get roasted too. I don't care. Bring it on, folks. I'm good with that. But I think that one of the things that makes the cheesesteak a little bit unique is that it is both of a place, but it's not something that you would consider a locavore cuisine. That
Mm.
it it's not unlike something like champagne in France that has a terroir that like it comes from this region, or San Marzano tomatoes in Italy that are specifically from, they have to be from a region and grown on the side of a mountain, or Kona coffee that is, you know, volcanic ash in the soil that makes it have a certain taste. The Philadelphia cheesesteak, it doesn't matter where the beef is from. Originally, that beef would have been from probably fairly close to Philadelphia based on the way uh, food and commodities worked in the 1930s. Like, it couldn't have necessarily been from, it wouldn't have been Kobe beef in the 1930s or 40s or 50s, but it, the same thing with the cheese, the same thing with the bread. It didn't have to be local. It was, but that isn't what makes people think of it as local today. And
Mm.
I think that there's also a, I think an idea that because it's something that's quote unquote just a sandwich, that maybe it isn't worthy of hardcore study the way other foods are. Um, I'm not a snob. I'll eat anything. I'm good with it. So I think it's worthy of it. And I'm not the only one. There's lots of other people that have done um, great work on it. Was it Carolyn Wyman? Uh, if anyone is a bard for the cheesesteak, the way uh, Proust was a bard for the Madeleine, it is absolutely Carolyn Wyman. Like, she wrote books on Jello and Spam, and so like she's got her, you know, she earned her stripes like within the realm of like blue collar cuisine, but um like she wrote the great Philly Cheesesteak book. She provides tours at Reading Terminal Market and talks about cheesesteaks there. She's lived in Philadelphia for decades. So I feel like there's, like, she has set forth a model and has really demystified the food. And the way she presents it is something that it tastes great. Everyone should enjoy it. And that, sure, there's the the rivalry between Pat's and Gino's as who has the original one, or who has the best one. But for her, it's more about bringing people to the city of Philadelphia and having them enjoy something that is an approachable and frankly off the chain, fantastic tasting food.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, this next one, Chrissy, I've been playing around with the title in my head as you're having this discussion of this notion of the, well, I'm gonna make a comparison to another film to go into our topic of film and media representation, but tying it into blue collar workers, and that is what I call like the Avengers food paradox. Give the reason, which is in the first Avengers film, they all go to shawarma at the very end. I guarantee you that was probably the first time any moviegoer ever heard of that food item, shawarma, in their life. And even more recently, in the Deadpool and Wolverine movie, towards the end, Deadpool says, the Avengers made uh, shawarma. And it's the notion of how that food item became popularized with the Avengers. I mean, it is referenced in every media they have. And I find that so interesting how some have argued that had the Avengers not used that, and let's say, oh, let's go out and get a burger, or let's go out to Five Guys, Storm would not have been, even a footnote in, pop culture history. But because they go to a shawarma place towards the end, instantly everyone thinks of shawarma with the Avengers. Now, I'm very curious, Chrissy, in your research, has that been very similar with the Philly cheesesteak, tying it into Rocky, who also kind of blends in with, the average day blue collar individual, blue collar worker?
So I think so that's fascinating to me. I feel like the concept of people being introduced to a food from film, Gabe, that's a whole other episode. I- I'll, I could talk for 12 hours on that. But I won't. Uh, stick to the topic. I think you're right. I think that there's absolutely a way that things can be introduced to people way outside of a geographical region. And the concept of introducing someone to something through a movie, um, I, I I like that as a little bit of a, what is the term? Um, I know the author who worked on this. I'm going to come back to it. Um, but the concept that you are introduced to something and that you can then embrace it and that you have an awareness of it from seeing it in film and then are able to recognize it in your own life. Counterfeit realism. There we go.
Mm.
That this concept of seeing something in a film or in a museum and that you're able to embrace it in your own life afterwards. So yeah, I think that you don't necessarily have to be a boxer and you don't necessarily have to do your workouts in gray sweatsuit running up and down the stairs outside the Philadelphia Museum of Art to appreciate that a cheesesteak is going to taste off the chain amazing after that. Um, and that being introduced to something through film and media doesn't lessen the amazingness of the thing itself, nor does it cheapen the thing itself. I think that things that are good are going to find their way to other people, whether it's somewhat a slower method or whether it's through like a box office hit like the Avengers telling everyone like, hey, shawarma's off the chain, you should have this. And yeah, I feel like um maybe it's something that is, I guess it's, there's something called the curse of knowledge, that once you know something, it's hard to remember what your life was like before you knew a thing. And so
Mm.
I'm trying to think of this in terms of like, what was my life like as far as things like hot sandwiches as I knew them before I knew what a cheesesteak was. And the first time I remember eating one, I was a toddler. Like I remember eating one as a little kid. I remember the house that I lived in, and it was like I, I'm sure that 3-year-old Chrissy didn't know what a cheesesteak was, but 4-year-old Chrissy definitely did. So it's very hard for me to think of in terms of like not knowing something, but that I've since come to love and appreciate in a different like nerdy academic way in addition to like a gustatory I want to eat that sort of way. um but yeah, I think that that's something that is like a cool way for people to find out about something. It's great when a platform like a superhero movie can introduce people to something that is amazing. And I I think it's I think it's a good thing. And maybe other people are a little bit like, "Oh, you learned about it from something." Like, no. No, like don't be a snob about it. If something's cool, it's cool regardless of how they got there.
Absolutely, absolutely. And now I'm actually very intrigued to talk about, the what's the word I'm thinking of, the identity of food in terms of like, who it actually, belongs to this notion of, what deems a food as, high end, middle class, working class. What does that entail? Is it the region that it's made? Is it for the clientele? Is it the ingredients? Because that also adds more, in a way, lore to any item of history. So, Chrissy, can you walk us through, in terms of looking at sort of like blue collar history of the cheesecake? As you mentioned earlier, the original cheesecake wasn't necessarily a cheesecake; it was a steak sandwich during the Great Depression, and it was only about afterwards, after Second World War, that the notion of a modern cheesesteak came about. But going back to its ancestry with the steak sandwich, what really made that food item a blue collar working food? And in your professional opinion, as it has evolved and changed with the times to fit new palates, do you think it's kind of lost its its identity of what it was before?
Okay, so I'm gonna make sure I understand what you're asking here before I before I answer and then go off on a tangent that you
Okay.
didn't ask, which I've been known to do. So you're asking, is is the cheesesteak still what it was, and how has it changed, and can it still be linked back to its heyday, its starting point? Am I getting that?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
As in you mentioned how, in like your discussions like off camera, like it has ties, the blue collar workers. It's meant to
Mhm.
be a very quick thing to get on the go when you're going to work. And has it maintained or lost that key identity to it?
So I think that maybe I think that's what I thought was really fascinating about studying the cheesesteak the first time. And it's stuck with me for more than a decade. And I've continued studying it. Is that what made it a blue collar food? And I don't say that term with any sort of like the pejorative sense. Like, it started as a food created by a hot dog vendor. He literally got tired of eating hot dogs, and so went down the street to a deli and got some like beef, and he chopped it up on his hot dog grill, and he was eating it one day. Legend has it that a taxi driver who used to buy hot dogs from him was driving past and said, "Hey, that looks good. Do you have another one?" The guy said, "No, but you can have this one." And so he like broke the sandwich in half, and the guy said, "You should be selling this, not hot dogs." And then he did. Like, so first of all, who takes advice from a friend? And has it turn out great? So like these are two things that have to happen that are kind of rare anyway. But the idea of like this was a hot dog vendor, like he had a hot dog cart, and so his customers were, you know, the working people of Philadelphia. They were in, this was near like shipyards and industrial areas. And these were people that were, as you said, getting lunch on the go. The the alternative was they would have been buying a hot dog from this person.
Right.
Now this is okay, replace sliced grilled steak with and onions with a hot dog. But it's still the same level of portability, the same ability to like eat it while you walk, eat it on the go. That hasn't changed. And sure, you can buy $100 cheesesteak in some places downtown. Now that also comes with like gold flakes and foie gras and a bottle of champagne to get it to that $100 amount. But
Hmm.
um, more often than not, it still is seen as it's not seen as something fancy. Sure, you could eat it in a sit down restaurant, but it's not like that maybe that's that difference between like everyday cuisine and like it's not haute cuisine. It's not like fancy French cuisine where it requires like an 18 place table setting and multiple courses to eat it. Like you can eat a cheesesteak while you walk. Uh, Not that you necessarily want to, not that you have to, but you could if you had to. And so
Yes.
I think in that way, the cheesesteak hasn't necessarily changed from its culinary origins.
No, and I think, as we're nearing the end of this incredible discussion, I think the Philly cheesesteak also is an evolution of food itself. Is that, you don't need to have a lot of fancy ingredients to make something, very tasty. It could be the most simplest of things, simplest of ingredients to make something very good and very, very delicious.
Mhm.
And just a few simple things. It's interesting. And I think if you look at, all food history in general, the evolution of when it got started to now. And one thing I find very fascinating, if you look at the Great Depression, I am very, very impressed by what people were able to make during that time that still tasted amazing. One my favorite things to make from the Depression is a wacky cake, which I don't know if you've heard of that, Chrissy, but it is by far the moistest chocolate cake I have ever had. By far, no milk, no butter, no eggs, and yet is the best chocolate cake I have ever had. And not to mention some abnormalities in food history, like the fake apple pie, which I'm
Mhm.
still blown away by that. And again, kind of tying it into this notion back to the Philly cheesesteak, what we know as like, the history of this food was not what it was, but after a few add-ons, it became this and it became cemented. Now, to your point, Chrissy, does it take away from like if you swap out, you know, portobello cheese with Swiss cheese or Monterey Jack or Cheese Whiz? You switch out the onions with like bell peppers and onions. What really makes it? Or as you mentioned before, does a chicken cheesesteak, have the same emotional connection as a regular Philly cheesesteak? It is so very, very fascinating. And I guess kind of like the second to last question before we wrap it up
Mhm.
is that why do you think that the Philly cheesesteak, for such a very simple food item in the plethora, in the pantry of American cuisine, has so many ties and branching points to other aspects of American culture and subculture?
So I love this question because I think that there's who was it? It was Alexander Badenoch. Um, he talked about the difference in like uh, he actually talked about this in terms of political history, but like milestones and like the
Mm,
milestones that make up the biography of everyday life. Um, and it's the idea that there's also the notion of like milestones of minutia. Um, and milestones of minutia really overlap really well with culinary history because they have a lot of weight on an individual level. Um, and something might be minor in like a world historical sense, but can still be extraordinarily impactful to a part of history. Um, and I feel like Cheese Whiz in that way is a milestone because it transformed what people think of in some ways as the notion of a cheesesteak that you can have a steak sandwich without cheese. You can have it with provolone. You can have it with Cheese Whiz. All of them are correct, and yet the invention of Cheese Whiz has somehow also made it more correct, if that makes sense.
mm,
Um, and Hugh Trevor Roper, like he talked about in like what is it? The invention of tradition. Um, that things don't necessarily have to be organically derived, and they can be somewhat recent. I mean, we're thinking of things from the 1930s, 40s, 50s. That's still fairly recent as far as history goes. Yet they can still take hold. Um, so like Cheese Whiz is the craft brand of the cheese sauce, but it wasn't invented until 1953. It doesn't mean that it's not a correct thing as it relates to the cheesesteak. So I feel like um, there's both a notion of novelty as well as a notion of authenticity as it relates to these things.
absolutely, Chrissy. And to cap off our amazing discussion, this one I've been thinking about for, throughout our discussion, and I would really love to hear your thoughts on it. So I'll get some context for this question. If you look at food history as a global thing, we think of, French cuisine, English cuisine, Spanish cuisine as having such rich lore and history behind it because Spanish cuisine is in some cases derived from Islamic cuisine, especially in southern Spain. French cuisine is, mix a little bit of Germanic and a little bit of Roman cuisine as well. Uh, British cuisine is a mix of Germanic, traditional Britain, a little bit of Celtic, a little bit of French, Norman. And when people think of American cuisine, they don't really say like America doesn't necessarily have a food history of itself, that America's only food history is the creation of the fast food. But in our discussion, I like to counter that our staples of American food are rich, have a lot of history, and should be treated like any other item in history because they also have roots. Ultimately, Chrissy, my question to you is, as a food historian researching the history of food globally, what would you want people, let's say fellow students or fellow historians who are watching this interview, to take away from our discussion about not just the history of the cheesecake, but the tied history of Americanism in food and the history of American food and the identity that is tied to it?
So something doesn't have to be ancient in order for its history to be valid and valuable.
Mm, that is a good answer. That is a really short and sweet to the point, but it is
You're never going
very,
to get
very
another
true.
short answer from me, Gabe. So take what you can get.
But it is actually very, very true. And I guess I'll add my own sense before we cap off this amazing discussion is, to a point, only a lot of people have thought American food history was only just a creation of fast food. And while that may be true to some extent, even fast food went through an evolution. Like hamburgers were originally from the sliders. The history of the hamburger itself is a food history because it was just a patty with some white bread, no cheese, no condiments, very, very basic. And even the burger itself is probably the most iconic thing in the United States. There are so many different versions, so many different names of the hamburger. The cheesesteak is no exception when it comes to, is it a hoagie, sub, or the other name that you mentioned. There are so many different things, but it doesn't take away from the history that it is. I mean, a lot of food history was created in response to events. The Depression was no exception.
Mhm.
You had the Civil War, American Revolutionary War, World War II. World War II's food history is quite shocking, and it would be, what's the one I'm thinking of? It would be unheard of to eat some of the food from the Second World War, and yet people did. And it doesn't take away from the overall history of what it is trying to show. So, Chrissy, you're absolutely right that the history of something doesn't have to be ancient to be validated. And I think that can be applied to not just food, but anything in history. And on that note, viewers and listeners, we finally end the month of February with this incredible and delicious Historians Lounge episode. I want to give a huge thank you to my friend, Dr. Chrissie Reilly, for coming
Mhm.
back on the show. Now, Chrissy, again, thank you so much for coming back. Always a pleasure. Where can people find you if they want to interact and connect? Do you have any upcoming projects you'd like to announce? Going to be going to any conferences for 2026?
Uh, I'm I'm always hustling, Gabe. Um, you can find me at letsmakehistory.com, and you can find me on LinkedIn, and I hope to present at the oral history association conference in Portland, Oregon this fall. And who knows? I've got half a dozen conference abstracts out there. We'll see which ones stick.
Absolutely. I will link all that down below in the description of this video. And if you'd like to see Chrissie back on again for a fourth appearance on the show talking about food history or a very special episode, you know what you have to do. Like this video, comment, and subscribe. And I made sure to remember this. If you would like to, let's say, have Chrissie do a follow-up interview, but she interviews me on the show because I know a lot of people liked it when I did the author one. If you would like to see Chrissie take the reins as the interviewer, do the exact same thing. Like this video, comment, and subscribe. And as always, viewers and listeners,
Do it,
thank
fam.
you so
Do
much.
it.
Thank you, everybody, for your love and support. I will see you all in March, which is tomorrow, for our very first episode for the March lineup. I have a lot of good familiar faces and new faces making their appearance, as well as you will see yours truly being featured on another person's podcast again. And until next time, this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill, signing out. Wish you all a wonderful evening wherever you are in the world. Happy Saturday, everybody, and we'll see you all tomorrow for March.